She wept for the man who marched off to war and never came home, her days hollowed out by waiting and loss. But when a cowboy took her hand and vowed, "You'll never be alone again," it left folks wondering, was this the love she had been waiting for all along, or the beginning of a brand new story she never imagined? The prairie wind carried with it a haunting kind of silence, the sort that made a woman feel she was the last soul left on earth. Elara Winford stood on the sagging porch of her farmhouse at Ironwood Ridge, her shawl drawn tight around her thin shoulders as the sun bled into the horizon. The war had taken more than it ever promised. Her husband had ridden away with the regiment 2 years ago and never returned. Letters had come, but they dwindled until nothing remained but the ache of waiting. Her neighbors had stopped asking after him. Some whispered that he'd died honorably, his body laid in some forgotten field. Others claimed desertion, muttering that Elara had been abandoned. Either way, the end result was the same. She was alone, bound to a farm that barely stood against the winds of time. The chickens had stopped laying, the fences leaned precariously, and the barn roof sagged like an old man's back. Elara tried. Every day she tried. But the truth was plain. She wasn't strong enough to hold it all together. Her hands trembled when she carried the water buckets. Her back ached when she lifted the hay. Nights were the worst, lying awake in the narrow bed that once held warmth, but now only reminded her of what she'd lost. And still, the town judged. The cursed widow, they called her at the mercantile. A husband lost to war, a farm destined to fail. Elara swallowed their cruelty, answering only with silence. That evening, as she bent to gather kindling at the woodpile, the faint sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. Her heart jerked. Was it? Could it be? For a fleeting second, she thought she might see her husband cresting the ridge, returning at last. But the rider who appeared was not him. Rowan Cade sat tall in the saddle, his weathered hat pulled low, the kind of man whose presence carried weight even before he spoke. His horse snorted, stamping the earth as he reined in before her porch. "Elara," he said simply, his voice deep, touched by gravel. She lifted her chin, bracing herself. "What brings you here, Rowan? If it's a pity, I've no use for it." His gaze softened, though his eyes held the shadows of his own past. "It ain't pity. I see a woman carrying more than she should have to." He dismounted, tying his reins to the porch rail. His boots creaked on the wooden steps as he looked her straight in the eye. "You've been alone long enough," he said, the words steady, not boastful, not hesitant. "And I'll be damned if I let it stay that way. You may not believe it now, but I'll see to it you'll never be alone again." The wind caught her breath before she could reply. Somewhere, deep inside, past the grief and suspicion, a flicker stirred. "Tell me, would you let a cowboy like Rowan Cade into your life after everything you've lost? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts." The mornings in Ironwood Ridge always began the same roosters, crowing into a silence too heavy for their song. Wind pressing against the warped shutters of Elara Winford's farmhouse, and the faint ache that came with waking up to emptiness. Her mind still reached, every dawn, for the warmth of a husband's arm that wasn't there. She'd see flashes in her dreams, his laugh, the way his calloused hands had held hers the night before he rode off to war. "I'll be back before you know it," he had promised, his blue coat gleaming as the bugle called. That was 2 years ago. Since then, she had lived with nothing but rumors. At the mercantile, whispers carried louder than the clinking of coins. "Her man ran off," one woman muttered, as Elara pretended to study bolts of fabric. "You'll see. She's cursed. Even the land won't grow for her." Their voices were knives, sharpened by curiosity and malice. She never answered them. What could she say? That she still clung to hope even as the seasons passed? That sometimes she prayed for his death, because at least then she could mourn in peace? That morning, she returned home to find a pile of firewood stacked neat against the side of the house. Fresh, split, and not hers. She spun, her heart leaping. She knew only one man in town, with the quiet decency to leave help without demanding thanks. Rowan Cade. Later, she found the fence mended along the north pasture, rails straightened and braced with new posts. When she touched the wood, it was still rough from fresh cutting. She looked out toward the ridge, and though she saw no rider, she knew who had done it. That evening, when Rowan did appear, she confronted him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, standing in the yard with her hands on her hips, a loose strand of hair blowing against her cheek. He shrugged, as though it were nothing. "Fence was fallen. The woodpile was low. Figured you could use the help. I didn't ask you." "No, ma'am. But you needed it just the same." His calmness stirred something in her chest, anger, gratitude, and something she dared not name. She wanted to tell him to stop, that it wasn't his burden, that she was fine. But her voice cracked when she said, "I don't need your charity." Rowan tipped his hat, unbothered. "Ain't charity. Just right." He paused, his eyes lingering on her with a weight that made her knees weak. "And if anyone's got a problem with that, they can take it up with me." That night, as Alara lit the lamp and sat at her table, she stared at the flame flickering in the glass. For the first time in a long while, she wondered, was it possible that the ache of waiting might be eased by someone who had never left her side to begin with? The thought frightened her, and yet it also warmed her more than the fire ever could. Rowan Cade wasn't a man who wasted words. Nor was he one who needed to explain himself to anybody in Ironwood Ridge. Folks knew him as the kind of cowboy who worked alone, came into town only when he had to, and left before the whiskey turned to arguments. But what no one knew, what he never said, was that the war had carved a hollow place inside him too. His brother, Samuel, had ridden off with the same regiment Elara's husband had joined. Unlike Elara, Rowan had received confirmation. Samuel's body had been shipped back under a flag. Rowan buried him with his own hands on a wind-swept hill that overlooked their childhood homestead. That grave haunted him, every ride, every night. Maybe that's why he couldn't stand by and watch Elara Winford crumble under the weight of her loneliness. Her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, carried the same raw emptiness he had once held. He recognized it, like a mirror. One evening, Rowan sat on the ridge above her farm, his horse grazing on the sparse grass. From that vantage, he could see her struggling with a bucket, nearly too heavy for her thin frame. She stumbled, spilled half the water, then sank onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. He clenched his jaw, feeling the old ache in his chest. He'd seen soldiers break under the burden of war, but to see a woman breaking under the burden of life, that was somehow worse. When he rode down and offered to fix the barn roof that night, she bristled. "Why do you care?" she asked, her tone sharp, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Rowan met her gaze evenly. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything and still wake up the next morning." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She only turned and walked back inside. As Rowan hammered new shingles into place, he thought of Samuel, of how his brother had been the better of them both, quicker to laugh, stronger of faith. Rowan had always been the reckless one, the one more comfortable with cards and a gun than with prayers. Yet here he was, patching a widow's roof, because he couldn't stand the thought of her falling further into despair. By the time dawn lit the sky, the barn stood strong again. Rowan leaned against the post, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't need it. But when Elara came out with a cup of coffee, her hands trembling as she held it toward him, he accepted. Their fingers brushed. Her touch was light, but it sent a current through him he hadn't felt in years. He realized then that helping her wasn't just about her survival, it was about his own redemption. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky above Ironwood Ridge glowed gold with the late summer sun, and the next it roared black and heavy with thunder. Elara scrambled to pull in what she could, baskets of laundry, tools left in the yard. But when the first crack of lightning split the sky, Her heart leapt to her throat. The barn. Inside were her last healthy cows, the only chance she had of keeping the farm alive through the winter. The wind screamed, rattling shutters and slamming doors. She grabbed a lantern and sprinted toward the barn, skirts whipping around her legs. The animals were panicked, hooves thundering, eyes wide with fear. She tried to calm them, but the roof above groaned, threatening to give way. "Move, girl!" a voice bellowed over the storm. Rowan Cade burst through the doors, rain streaming down his face, his broad shoulders dark against the lantern light. He seized a rope, lashing open the pen to lead the animals to safer ground. Together, they fought side by side, Elara pushing from behind, Rowan pulling with steady force. A beam cracked, splinters flying past Elara's cheek. For one terrifying moment, she thought the barn would collapse with them inside. But Rowan's hand closed around her wrist, strong and unyielding. "Stay with me," he growled, hauling her out into the rain. By the time they reached the paddock, the storm raged at full fury. Sheets of water soaked them to the bone, but the cows were safe. Rowan turned back toward the farmhouse, his arm still wrapped around Elara as if he wasn't sure she'd keep her footing. Inside, drenched and shivering, Elara stared at him. His shirt clung to his chest, his breath ragged, but his eyes were steady, protective. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "So could you," he replied, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. His touch lingered, tender in a way that made her heart pound harder than the thunder outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm screamed at the windows, but in that fragile silence, Elara felt something shift between them. Trust, fragile and dangerous, had begun to take root. And she feared it more than the storm itself. Ironwood Ridge was a town where whispers traveled faster than dust in the wind. By the week after the storm, the saloon was alive with speculation. "Cowboy's spendin' too much time at the widow's place," one man said, swirling his whiskey. "Ain't proper." Another smirked. "Maybe she doesn't mind. Maybe she's been lonely too long." The laughter that followed was sharp, ugly. Rowan Cade, standing at the bar, heard every word. His jaw tightened. He had tolerated many things in his life: mockery, hardship, loss. But he would not tolerate cruelty toward Elara Winford. He turned, slow and deliberate, until his shadow fell across the men's table. The room quieted. "Say it again," he drawled, his voice low, carrying the dangerous calm of a man who'd seen too much violence to fear it. The man swallowed hard, his bravado shrinking. "Just talk, Cade. Nothing meant by it." Rowan leaned down, his gaze piercing. "You want to talk about me, but you leave her name out of your mouth. Understand?" The silence in the saloon was heavy, broken only by the creak of leather and the slow plink of piano keys. Finally, the men nodded, eyes dropping. Rowan straightened, adjusted his hat, and walked out without another word. Outside, the cool night air hit him like water. He hadn't meant for Elara to become the subject of gossip. She didn't deserve that weight. Yet as he strode down the street, he realized he didn't regret defending her. That evening, Elara found him on her porch. "They're talking, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Rowan hesitated, then nodded. "Doesn't matter what they say." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight. "It matters to me. Every word cuts deeper than they know." Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She stiffened, but didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, rough calluses against delicate skin. "Elara," he said softly, "the world can say what it wants, but I know who you are, and if they can't see that, to hell with them." Her lips parted as if to answer, but the words caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, they stood in the glow of the lantern, two souls bound by loss, yet tethered by something new, fragile, and dangerous. She pulled her hand back first. "Good night, Rowan." And yet, when she closed the door, she leaned against it, her heart racing not with fear, but with longing. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, a place Elara rarely entered anymore. The floorboards groaned beneath her steps as she carried a lamp up the narrow stairs, the flame flickering against the low rafters. She told herself she was looking for quilts to ward off the chill that crept through the farmhouse at night. But deep down, she knew why she had come. There was a box waiting for her, a box she had avoided for too long. It sat in the far corner, tucked beneath an old trunk. The wood was scuffed, its brass latch dulled with time. Elara knelt, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside lay stacks of folded paper, tied together with twine, her letters, dozens of them. Letters she had written to her husband during the war, pouring her heart into ink but never mailed. At first, because she didn't know where to send them. Later, because hope itself had withered, and sending them felt like admitting to the void. She lifted one bundle free, untied the twine, and unfolded a letter. Her handwriting wavered in the lamplight. My love, I dream of you each night. The bed is cold without you. Some mornings I wake convinced you've returned, only to feel the emptiness beside me. Come home soon. I don't know how much longer I can bear this waiting. Her throat tightened. She pressed the paper to her chest, rocking slightly, as if the words themselves could warm her. A sound startled her, the creak of the stair below, Rowan Cade's boots on the steps. She scrambled to gather the letters, but one slipped free, fluttering to the floor just as he entered, carrying a basket of firewood for the attic stove. Rowan bent instinctively to pick it up. His eyes scanned the words before she could snatch it away. His face softened, his usual guarded calm replaced by something raw. Elara. His voice was hushed, almost reverent. Don't, she whispered, clutching the bundle to her chest, her cheeks burning. They're nothing, just foolish ramblings. Rowan shook his head, holding the page with care as if it were fragile glass. Number, these aren't foolish. These are your hearts. Her eyes brimmed with tears. I wrote them when I still believed he'd return, when I still thought I mattered to him. You do matter, Rowan said firmly, lowering himself onto the floor beside her. His voice carried the weight of a man who knew loss, more than you'll ever know. The words broke something inside her. She pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. I don't know how to let him go. I don't know if I should. Rowan placed the letter back into her lap, his gaze steady, unwavering. Maybe you don't have to let him go. Maybe you just have to make room for what's here, for what's real. The attic was silent, but for the beating of her heart, too loud in her chest. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The strength in his jaw, the scars of sorrow in his eyes, the quiet steadiness that had carried her these many months. For a fleeting moment, she imagined leaning forward, closing the space between them. But fear held her back. Fear of betraying a memory. Fear of trusting too soon. When Rowan rose to leave, she clutched one of the letters so tightly the paper crumpled in her hand. And though the attic grew quiet again, her heart thundered with a truth she could no longer deny. Her grief was no longer hers alone to bear. The wind that evening carried a strange unease, stirring dust devils along Ironwood Ridge's main street. The sun hung low, copper red against the horizon, when a lone rider appeared. His horse was gaunt, its flanks streaked with sweat, and the man astride it bore the look of someone carved hollow by war. His uniform coat was ragged, the blue dulled to gray, and his eyes, sunken, restless, spoke of things no man should have seen. He stopped first at the saloon, ordering nothing but water. The townsfolk studied him in wary silence. His presence drew questions, but his silence drew more. By nightfall, the whispers had already reached Elara Winford's door. She was in the kitchen, her hands buried in flour. When the knock came, the sound froze her mid-motion. For years, she had prayed for such a knock, the sound of a soldier returning. Her heart thundered as she wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. The stranger's shadow filled the frame. "You're Elara Winford?" he asked, his voice rough. as though scraped raw by smoke and dust. Her throat went dry. Yes, I am. Rowan Cade was there too, leaning against the porch rail, one boot propped casually, though his eyes were sharp as flint. The man stepped forward, tugging off his battered hat. I knew your husband. Fought beside him in the early days. Elara's knees nearly gave way. Her hand clutched the doorframe as she whispered, Tell me, please tell me what happened. The stranger hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. He spoke of endless marches, of mud-soaked fields, and nights filled with cannon fire. He told of how her husband had fought bravely at first, how he carried himself like a man determined to return home. Elara's chest swelled with hope, and then the man's voice faltered. Your husband. He swallowed hard, his jaw working. He didn't die, ma'am. Not then. Last I saw him, he was alive. But he wasn't with us anymore. He walked away, deserted, left us all behind. The words struck like a gunshot. Elara staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. No, that can't be. The stranger's eyes were haunted. I wish it weren't true, but a woman has a right to know. Don't waste your life waiting for a man who chose to leave. The room seemed to tilt. Her letters, her prayers, her long nights staring into the dark, they all crumbled into dust beneath that revelation. Her knees buckled, and Rowan was there in an instant, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her against the solid strength of his chest. His voice was a low rumble, meant only for her. Easy, Elara. I've got you. He lifted his head to the stranger, his tone sharp as a drawn blade. You've said your piece, now ride on. The man nodded solemnly, tipping his hat before mounting and vanishing into the gathering dusk. Elara sobbed into Rowan's shirt, her tears soaking the fabric. He left me, she whispered, broken. He chose to leave. Rowan held her tighter, his hands steady on her back. Then hear me, Elara. Whatever choices he made, they ain't yours to carry. You're not alone, not now, not ever. I'll see to that. And though her heart was shattered anew, in Rowan's arms she felt for the first time the faintest thread of something stronger than despair. The days after the stranger's revelation felt like walking through a dream half remembered. Elara Winford could not leave her house without feeling the sting of whispers. At the mercantile, women leaned close, their voices sharp as needles. Her husband deserted, left her to rot. At the blacksmiths, men shook their heads. A woman left behind like that. No wonder her lands falling to ruin. Ironwood Ridge was not a place where secrets stayed buried. And when the truth of her husband's desertion spread, it carried with it more than gossip. It carried opportunity for men who saw her as weak. It began with a knock on her door. 3 ranchers stood outside, their hats low, their boots coated with trail dust. They spoke politely at first, offering to buy her land for a sum so low it bordered on insult. Best to cut your losses, one said, his grin sharp as a knife. A widow's got no use for all this ground. Elara closed the door in their faces, but their laughter lingered on the wind. The next day, she found her fence cut along the south pasture. Cattle had strayed into her neighbor's field, and it took all morning to drive them back. By sundown, another section was broken. It wasn't neglect, it was sabotage. The message was clear. She was vulnerable, and her land ripe for the taking. But what those men hadn't counted on was Rowan Cade. Rowan had been watching from the ridge, his eyes narrowed as he tracked the rancher's movements. When they returned on the 3rd day, riding hard up her lane with the swagger of men who thought they owned the world, Rowan was waiting at the fence line. He sat tall in the saddle, his hat shadowing his eyes, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The way he held himself left no doubt this was a man who had seen worse than bluster, a man not easily moved. You boys are lost, Rowan drawled, his voice carrying across the field like a rifle shot. This land ain't for the taking. One of the ranchers spat into the dirt. And who's gonna stop us? You? Rowan smiled without warmth. Me. and anyone else who gives a damn about right and wrong. Behind him, figures began to appear: farmers, shopkeepers, even the blacksmith wiping his hands on his apron. One by one, they came to stand behind Rowan, shamed into action by his example. The very townsfolk who had whispered against Elara now stood with her, because Rowan Cade had made it impossible not to. The ranchers' bravado faltered. They muttered curses, spat in the dust, and turned their horses away. The sound of their retreat was a relief, but the sight of Rowan standing firm at her side carved itself into Elara's heart. That night, she found him leaning against the porch rail, his hat tipped back as he studied the stars. "Why do you keep standing for me?" she asked softly, her voice thick with unspent tears. He turned, his gaze steady. "Because you're worth it, even if you don't believe it yet." Her breath caught, and in that moment, Elara realized something she hadn't dared admit before. Rowan Cade was not just protecting her land, he was protecting her heart. For days after the stranger's visit, Elara wandered the farm like a woman caught between two worlds. The truth gnawed at her with every breath. Her husband had not died bravely on some distant field. He had walked away, deserted his brothers in arms, deserted her. The thought was worse than death, for it meant he had chosen to leave. She carried the box of unsent letters with her like an anchor, reading them until the words blurred with tears. In every line, she saw a woman begging, pleading for love that was never returned. What did that make her? A fool? Or simply a wife who had believed too much in a promise that had never meant anything? One evening, as the sun sank behind Ironwood Ridge, she sat in the garden, clutching a crumpled letter, her sobs breaking the quiet. Rowan Cade found her there, his shadow stretching long across the soil. He didn't speak at first. He simply lowered himself beside her, his presence steady, patient. Finally, she whispered, "I wasn't enough for him to stay. I wasn't worth the fight." Rowan's jaw tightened. His hand hovered above hers before he finally clasped it, strong and sure. "Don't you say that. Don't you ever say that." Her eyes filled, meeting his. "How else do I make sense of it? If he left, it means I wasn't enough." Rowan leaned closer, his voice rough but certain. "Some men run from love, Elara. They can't carry the weight of it. They're too afraid of what it asks of them. But me—" His thumb brushed the tears from her cheek, lingering there as if to stake a claim. "I ride toward it. Every damn time." The words struck her deeper than any letter ever had. She searched his face, seeing not pity, but fierce devotion carved into every line. This was no man running. This was a man standing firm, offering his whole heart without condition. Elara's breath trembled. "What if I'm too broken? What if I've nothing left to give?" Rowan's lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes shone with unspoken pain. "Then let me carry it. I've shouldered worse burdens, and I'll shoulder this one gladly, if it means you'll let me stand beside you." Silence hung between them, heavy as the dusk. The cicadas sang their mournful song, and the air smelled of earth and wild sage. Slowly, as if pulled by something greater than choice, Elara leaned into him. Her forehead rested against his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong. Rowan wrapped his arms around her, enclosing her in a strength she hadn't known in years. His breath brushed her hair as he whispered, "I ain't asking you to forget him. I'm asking you to choose yourself, to choose what's real, to choose now." Her lips trembled as she lifted her face, and in that fragile space between grief and hope, she kissed him. Soft at first, then desperate, as though sealing a promise neither dared speak aloud. For the first time since the war stole her world, Elara felt alive, and for the first time in his wandering life, Rowan Cade knew he had found the one place he would never leave. Dawn rose gently over Ironwood Ridge, the kind of dawn that felt like a promise kept. Pale gold light spilled across the hills, touching the farmhouse with warmth that hadn't been felt there in years. Elara Winford stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under her bare feet. For the first time in what seemed like a lifetime, her heart wasn't heavy. The silence of the morning was no longer unbearable, it was peaceful. Rowan Cade was already in the yard, saddling his horse with the quiet ease of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. When he looked up and saw her, he smiled. Not the fleeting smile of politeness, but the slow, steady kind that told her she was no longer standing alone in the world. The weeks since her choice had passed like a dream, where once her days had been filled with exhaustion and grief. Now there was strength in them, Rowan's strength beside her own. He helped mend the fields, guided the cattle, patched every broken board and rail with hands steady and sure. But more than that, he filled the spaces inside her that had long been hollow. She descended the steps and met him at the gate. He tipped his hat. "Morning, Elara." Her lips curved. "You're always up before me." "Old habit," he said. "World don't wait for a man to catch up." He paused, his gaze softening. "Or a woman." She leaned against the fence, watching the sun paint the ridge in fire and gold. "Do you ever wonder," she whispered, "if this is real? After everything, after all I lost, it feels like I shouldn't be allowed to have this." Rowan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint leather and dust that clung to his clothes. "It's real, and it's yours. Nobody can take it now." Her throat tightened, but she nodded, believing him. Later that day, they worked side by side in the fields. Rowan swung the axe with practiced rhythm, while Elara stacked the split wood, her laughter spilling free when he teased her about her crooked piles. In the afternoon, she knelt in the garden, pulling weeds while Rowan hammered new shingles on the roof. From time to time, he'd glance down, catching her eye, and every glance carried a promise without words. As evening fell, they saddled the horse together. Rowan lifted her up, steadying her with his hands at her waist, and climbed up behind her. The two of them rode out across Ironwood Ridge, the land stretching wide and free before them. The wind tangled her hair, and she laughed a sound so bright Rowan felt it burn into his memory. On the crest of the ridge, they stopped. The valley below glowed in the fading light, and the sky burned with colors only the west could paint. Rowan leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "You'll never be alone again," he whispered. Elara closed her eyes, letting the words sink into every scar, every hollow place inside her. And for the first time in years, she believed it with all her heart. Together, they rode on, not as widow and cowboy, but as two souls who had found in each other what they thought they had lost forever. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.